You don't notice the man who keeps everything running until everything stops. The words didn't echo out loud, but they hung in the air the moment the glass doors slid shut behind him, sealing the boardroom in a silence that felt engineered, precise, expensive. Ethan Cole stood at the far end of the long obsidian table, his reflection faintly visible in its polished surface, shoulders squared but still, like he had already calculated every outcome and chosen not to react. Across from him, 12 executives in tailored suits shifted in their seats, some glancing at their watches, others scrolling through tablets glowing with numbers they barely understood, while at the head of the table, Richard Halvorsen leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the city skyline stretching behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows that filtered in a cold, late-afternoon light. "Let's be clear," Richard said, his voice calm in that practiced way that carried authority without effort. "We're discussing strategy, not maintenance." A few quiet chuckles followed, not loud. Enough to be disrespectful, just enough to draw a line, to remind everyone who belonged in the conversation and who didn't. Ethan didn't move, his badge still clipped neatly to his belt, a simple identifier in a room full of titles that sounded heavier than they were. The hum of the building's central system pulsed faintly beneath the silence, air conditioning whispering through vents, lights buzzing overhead. The kind of background noise no one ever noticed until it disappeared. "I'm not here about maintenance," Ethan said, his voice even, not raised, not defensive, just present, like a fact placed gently on the table. A woman near the center frowned slightly, tapping her pen against a legal pad, while another man leaned back, crossing his arms with a subtle shake of his head. Richard tilted his head, studying Ethan with a look that wasn't anger, just mild curiosity, like examining something that didn't quite fit. "Then why are you here?" he asked, and the question carried weight. Not because of the words, but because of who was asking. Ethan's eyes moved briefly to the screen at the far wall, lines of financial projections scrolling in clean, confident columns, green numbers signaling growth, stability, control, all the things this room believed it had. "Because the system those numbers depend on," Ethan said, pausing just long enough for the hum of the room to fill the gap, "isn't stable." The silence that followed was different this time. Thinner, sharper, like glass under pressure. Someone shifted in their chair. Another cleared their throat, and for a moment, the room hesitated between dismissal and attention. Richard exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not amused, not impressed, just finished. "Our engineers signed off on it," he replied, tapping the table once with his finger, a soft, controlled sound that carried more authority than any raised voice. "And unless you've recently joined that team, I don't see why we're having this conversation." A ripple of agreement moved around the table. Subtle nods, quiet affirmations, the kind that built walls without anyone admitting they were doing it. Ethan's reflection flickered slightly as the light shifted, clouds moving across the sun outside, casting the room in a cooler tone, and for a second, the entire space felt less certain, less solid. "You're routing critical processes through a failsafe that hasn't been tested under full load," Ethan said, still calm, still measured, like he was reading from something he already knew by heart. "If it fails, it won't degrade gradually, it will stop." The word lingered, heavier than the others. Richard's smile didn't change, but his eyes did, narrowing just enough to signal the end of patience. "Security," he said, not loudly, not angrily, just decisively. "Escort him out." Chairs shifted, a few people avoided eye contact, others watched with quiet interest, as if this were just another minor disruption in a day built on control. Near the door, a uniformed guard stepped forward, his shoes making soft, deliberate contact with the carpet, while Ethan remained where he was, not resisting, not arguing, just standing there as if the moment had already passed. Then, without warning, the lights above flickered once, a brief stutter that most people dismissed as nothing. But Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, tracking the change with quiet precision. The screens along the wall glitched, numbers freezing mid-scroll, then resetting in uneven bursts, and the steady hum beneath the room faltered, dipping just enough to be felt more than heard. Someone laughed nervously. Another tapped their tablet, trying to refresh the data, but the system didn't respond the way it was supposed to. Richard's fingers stopped tapping the table, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly as he looked toward the screens, then back at Ethan, who hadn't moved. The guard hesitated, just for a second, caught between instruction and uncertainty, while the room held its breath in a way no one would later admit. Ethan didn't speak again, didn't explain, didn't point at the screens or the flickering lights. He just stood there in the shifting glow, calm, steady. As the first cracks in the system began to show themselves, quiet and precise, exactly where he said they would be. The room did not recover all at once. It unraveled in small, almost polite failures, like a machine trying to pretend it was still in control while quietly losing its grip. Ethan stepped back as the guard hesitated, not out of fear, but because the moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the system, and the system was beginning to speak for itself. The overhead lights flickered again, this time longer, casting sharp shadows across the polished table, turning confident faces into uncertain silhouettes. A low chime echoed from one of the monitors, followed by another, then a cascade of alerts that layered over each other in a rhythm that felt wrong. Too fast, too uncoordinated. What is happening? Someone asked, their voice tight, controlled, but no longer calm. Fingers moved quickly across glass screens, tapping, swiping, refreshing, but the data did not stabilize. It looped, reset, and stuttered like it was searching for something it could not find. Ethan turned slightly toward the wall of servers visible through the glass partition beyond the hallway, their indicator lights blinking in uneven patterns, no longer synchronized, no longer predictable. He had spent years in that room, nights that stretched past midnight, tracing signals, mapping dependencies, learning the quiet language of a system no one else bothered to understand. He knew the difference between noise and warning, between a delay and a failure, and this was not noise. This was structure slipping. Get IT on the line, Richard said, sharper now, the first edge of urgency breaking through his controlled tone. An assistant nodded quickly, already dialing, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. The call connected, voices overlapping, technical terms thrown into the air without context, without clarity. We are seeing inconsistencies in transaction logs, a voice said through the speaker, distant and strained. The backup routing is not holding. Another added, cutting in. Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting back to Ethan, who stood near the door now, still, observant, not stepping forward, not stepping away. Fix it, Richard said into the phone, each word deliberate, heavy with expectation. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough to matter. We are trying. The voice replied, less certain this time. But the failsafe is not responding the way it should. The phrase hung in the air, echoing Ethan's earlier words without anyone acknowledging it. The guard glanced at Richard, waiting for confirmation, for direction, but Richard did not look at him. His attention locked on the screens, on the numbers that were no longer behaving. Ethan adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag on his shoulder, a small, almost invisible movement, but one that marked a shift, not in the room, but in him. He was no longer part of the conversation. He was the context they were missing. Outside the window, the city continued as if nothing had changed, cars moving in steady lines, people crossing streets, unaware that inside this room, control was becoming something fragile, something negotiable. Roll back the last deployment, someone suggested, their voice rising slightly, searching for certainty. We cannot, came the reply. The dependencies have already propagated. The words landed like quiet confirmations of a deeper problem. One that did not have a quick fix, one that required understanding, not just action. Ethan remembered the night he had traced that exact pathway, watching how one small adjustment could ripple outward, touching systems no one had mapped, creating connections no one had documented. He had written it down, documented the risk, sent the report, and watched it disappear into a chain of approvals that never reached the people who needed to see it. Now, the system was revealing that truth on its own. Richard finally looked directly at Ethan, really looked this time, not at his badge, not at his position, but at him. You said it would stop, he said, the words quieter now, stripped of their earlier certainty. Ethan met his gaze, steady, without accusation, without satisfaction. "It has not stopped yet," he replied, his voice calm, almost gentle, "but it will." Another alert sounded, louder this time, cutting through the room like a signal no one could ignore. The main display froze. Completely, numbers locked in place, then slowly dimmed as if the system itself was taking a breath before letting go. The silence that followed was no longer engineered. It was real, heavy, and undeniable. Ethan reached for the door handle, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, like every movement he made. And as the door opened, letting in the softer, steadier sounds of the hallway beyond, the room behind him remained suspended in that fragile moment between control and collapse, a moment he had seen coming long before anyone else even knew where to look. By the time the elevator doors closed behind Ethan, the noise from the boardroom had already begun to distort into something distant and fractured, like a signal losing clarity the farther it traveled from its source. The polished metal walls reflected a muted version of him, steady posture, quiet eyes, a man who did not look like the center of a crisis, and that was exactly why no one had ever paid attention. The elevator descended smoothly at first, a soft hum beneath his feet, controlled and predictable, but then it paused for half a second between floors, a barely noticeable delay that most people would ignore, except Ethan did not, his gaze lifting slightly toward the indicator panel as the numbers flickered before settling again. He did not press any buttons, did not reach for his phone. He simply stood there, listening, because systems always spoke before they failed, if you knew how to hear them. When the doors opened to the main operations floor, the contrast was immediate. Rows of desks lit by overhead panels, monitors glowing with streams of data, and people moving faster than usual, not running, not panicking, but no longer relaxed. Conversations overlapped, voices lower than normal, urgent without being loud, as if everyone was trying to maintain the illusion of control while quietly realizing it was slipping. Ethan stepped out, his shoes making soft contact with the polished concrete, blending into the environment he knew better than anyone in the building. A large wall display at the far end showed system performance metrics, or at least it tried to, graphs freezing mid-update, then jumping forward in uneven bursts, numbers recalculating faster than they could stabilize. "We are getting inconsistent reads from the backup cluster," a technician said, leaning over a workstation, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, refreshing logs that refused to align. "That should not be possible," another replied, shaking her head, eyes fixed on the screen as if staring harder might force the system to behave. Ethan slowed near the edge of the floor, not stepping into the center of the activity, not interrupting, just observing the pattern forming in real time. The same pattern he had mapped months ago, documented, submitted, and watched disappear into silence. The room smelled faintly of warm electronics and recycled air, the constant low hum of servers bleeding through the walls, a sound he had come to recognize like a heartbeat, steady when healthy, uneven when something was wrong. Now, that rhythm was shifting, subtle but undeniable. A manager in a dark suit moved quickly between desks, issuing instructions, trying to coordinate responses that were already lagging behind the problem. "Route traffic to the secondary node," he said, pointing at a screen, his voice controlled, but tighter than before. "We tried that," someone answered without looking up. "It is not holding the load." The words echoed across the floor, not dramatic, not loud, but heavy enough to settle into the space like a weight. Ethan's eyes moved to the server access door at the far end, secured, restricted, a place most people on this floor had never entered, but he had, countless times, tracing lines of code and hardware connections that no one else had the patience to follow. He remembered the night the failsafe was implemented, how it looked solid on paper, efficient, streamlined, but built on assumptions that had never been tested under real pressure. Assumptions that now, quietly, were collapsing. A notification sound chimed from somewhere behind him, followed by another, then a series of alerts that spread across the room like a ripple, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. People began to stand, not in panic, but in recognition that something larger was happening. Ethan remained where he was, his presence almost invisible among the movement, yet central to everything unfolding. He did not reach for a terminal, did not offer instructions, did not announce what he already knew. Because this moment was not about proving anything. It was about letting the truth surface on its own, across the floor. One of the main displays went dark for a brief second, then returned with a delayed feed, numbers out of sync, timestamps misaligned. A system trying to rebuild coherence from fragments. "We need a full system audit," someone said, their voice cutting through the noise, searching for a direction that did not yet exist. Ethan exhaled slowly, a measured breath, as his reflection flickered faintly on the glass panel beside him. The same calm expression, the same steady gaze, unchanged by the growing urgency around him. He had seen this moment long before it arrived, not as a prediction, but as a certainty. Built into the structure itself, a consequence waiting patiently for the right conditions. And now, as the room continued to fill with controlled urgency and quiet confusion, Ethan Cole stood at the edge of it all. Not as an outsider, not as an intruder, but as the one person who understood exactly where control had already been lost, and exactly who still held the key to bringing it back. No one told Ethan to stop, and that was the first signal that everything had already shifted. Authority in the room had begun to scatter, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way decisions lose their center when certainty disappears. He moved toward the secured server corridor at the far end of the operations floor, his pace steady, unhurried, as if he were simply continuing a routine no one else had noticed. A badge reader blinked beside the reinforced door, its small green light, pulsing in a rhythm that no longer matched the system behind it. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, his fingers brushing the edge of his access card, not rushing, not hesitating, just aligning his movement with the timing he understood better than anyone. Behind him, voices continued to layer, instructions overlapping, corrections following corrections, each attempt to fix the system creating new inconsistencies that spread faster than they could be contained. "We are losing synchronization across all nodes," someone said, their voice sharper now, cutting through the hum of machines and the low tension in the room. "Then isolate the affected segments," another replied quickly, searching for a boundary that no longer existed. Ethan lifted his badge and held it to the reader, the device emitting a soft beep, followed by a pause. Then another flicker of light before the lock disengaged with a muted click that sounded almost hesitant. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the temperature dropping slightly as the controlled environment of the server corridor wrapped around him. Cooler air, tighter space, the constant layered hum of hardware forming a dense, steady backdrop. Rows of server racks extended in precise alignment, indicator lights blinking in patterns that were no longer uniform, clusters of green interrupted by sudden bursts of amber. Small signals of imbalance that would mean nothing to most people but everything to him. He walked between the racks, his eyes moving not randomly, but with purpose, tracing connections, mapping behavior in real time against the structure he had built in his mind over years of observation. Each step echoed softly against the polished floor, absorbed quickly by the controlled acoustics of the room, leaving only the sound of airflow and electrical activity. On the far wall, a central console displayed a condensed view of the system, not simplified, but abstracted into layers of data that required understanding to interpret. Ethan stopped in front of it, his reflection merging with the shifting lights on the screen, his face calm, focused, unchanged by the urgency outside. He reached forward and rested his hand lightly on the console, not typing, not intervening, just feeling the moment, confirming what he already knew. The failsafe had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because it had been trusted without being understood, integrated without being tested, relied upon by people who believed control came from position rather than comprehension. A new alert appeared on the screen, a cascading error that spread across multiple nodes, each line of text precise, clinical, and quietly definitive. Ethan exhaled slowly, a measured breath, as the pattern completed itself. Outside the corridor, footsteps approached, faster now, less controlled, the sound of urgency catching up to reality. The door behind him opened again, letting in a wave of warmer air and the faint echo of raised voices, and Richard Halvorsen stepped inside, his presence no longer composed in the same effortless way it had been in the boardroom. His suit was still perfect, his posture still upright, But something in his expression had shifted, a narrowing of focus, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond the reach of command alone. "What did you do?" Richard asked, not accusing. Not yet, but searching, his voice lower, more controlled than the tension around him. Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still on the console, still tracking the system as it continued to destabilize in precise, predictable ways. "Nothing," he replied after a moment, his tone even, almost quiet. "I stopped correcting it." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but carrying a weight that the room could not ignore. Richard took a step closer, his eyes moving across the screen, trying to read what he was seeing, trying to translate data into understanding without the framework Ethan had built over time. "Then fix it," he said, the command still there, but thinner now, less certain. Ethan finally turned, meeting his gaze directly, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, as if the hierarchy that had defined the room upstairs no longer applied in this space. The lights from the server racks reflected faintly across his face, shifting patterns of green and amber that mirrored the system behind him. "It is not something you fix in a moment," he said, his voice calm, measured, grounded in reality rather than urgency. "It is something you understand, or it keeps happening." Another alert chimed, louder this time, followed by a brief flicker in the overhead lights, the system outside continuing to strain under its own design. Richard did not respond immediately, his attention caught between the screen and the man standing in front of it, the one person he had dismissed only minutes earlier. And in that narrow corridor, surrounded by machines that no longer obeyed simple commands, the balance of control shifted again, not through force, not through noise, but through something quieter, more precise, and far more difficult to ignore. The next alert did not sound louder, but it lasted longer, a sustained tone that cut through the corridor with a clarity that no one could ignore. And for the first time since entering the server room, Richard did not try to speak over it. He watched the console as another cluster of nodes shifted from green to amber, then to a muted red that pulsed slowly, deliberately, as if marking time rather than signaling panic. "How long?" he asked, the question quieter now, stripped of command, shaped instead by urgency that could no longer hide behind confidence. Ethan turned his attention back to the screen, scanning the cascading logs as they updated in uneven intervals, each delay telling him more than the data itself. "Minutes," he said, not guessing, not estimating, but stating what the system had already decided. Behind them, the door remained open, and through it, the sound of the operations floor had changed, no longer layered and controlled but sharper, more fragmented, voices rising slightly as coordination gave way to reaction. Footsteps passed quickly, then doubled back, then stopped altogether, as if movement itself had become uncertain. Richard ran a hand along the edge of the console, not touching the keys, just grounding himself in something physical, something solid, while the digital world around him lost its structure. "What do you need?" he asked after a moment, the words measured, careful, as if each one carried weight now. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes tracing the final alignment of failures, watching how one segment's instability fed into another, creating a chain that no single command could break. He reached forward and tapped a key, not to fix anything, but to pull up a deeper layer of the system, one that most people in the company did not even know existed, a map of dependencies that extended far beyond the surface metrics displayed in the boardroom. Lines of data expanded across the screen, complex, interconnected, revealing a structure that had grown over time without proper understanding. "You built on top of something you never stabilized," Ethan said, his voice calm, not accusatory, but clear. "And now it is collapsing under its own assumptions." Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze. "Corridor," a voice called out, louder than before. "We just lost transaction integrity on the East cluster," followed by another. "Backups are not matching primary logs." The words echoed into the server room, confirming what Ethan already knew, what the system had already shown him. Richard straightened slightly, the instinct to regain control still present, but now constrained by reality. "Do it," he said, the command returning in form, but not in force. Ethan did not move immediately, his hand resting near the console, his posture unchanged, as if he were measuring something beyond the system itself. "If I step in now," he said slowly, "I take control of the core routing." Richard nodded once, quickly. "Then take it." Ethan's gaze held on him for a moment longer, not challenging, not seeking permission, but ensuring understanding. "That means every decision passes through one point," he continued. "And if you override it without understanding, this happens again." The hum of the servers seemed to deepen, or perhaps it was just more noticeable now, filling the space between words. Richard hesitated, not long, but long enough to reveal the shift, the moment where control was no longer assumed, but negotiated. "You have it," he said finally, the words quieter than any command he had given before. Ethan turned back to the console, his fingers moving now with precision, not rushing, not reacting, but executing a sequence he had prepared long before this moment arrived. The system responded differently this time, not immediately correcting, but acknowledging the change, rerouting processes, isolating unstable segments, creating a temporary structure within the failure. The lights on the server racks shifted again, some returning to green, others holding steady in amber, the chaos beginning to organize into something controlled. Outside, the noise of the operations floor softened slightly, not calm, but no longer escalating. And in that narrow corridor, with the system still fragile but no longer collapsing unchecked, the balance had fully shifted, not because someone demanded control, but because the only person who understood it had finally taken it. The system did not return to normal. It breathed, slow and uneven, like something recovering from strain, and for the first time since the alerts began, the room allowed itself a moment of quiet that was not forced, not engineered, but real. Ethan's hands moved across the console with measured precision, each command placed carefully, not to rush the process but to stabilize it, to give the system structure it had never truly had. The lights along the server racks softened, fewer amber pulses, more steady. Green, though not all, never all, not yet. The hum in the room changed, deeper now, more consistent, like a rhythm finding its way back after losing time. Richard stood just behind him, no longer issuing instructions, no longer interrupting, his presence still strong but altered, quieter, as if he had stepped into a space where authority had different rules. Outside the corridor, the noise of the operations floor had shifted again, voices lower, more focused, less reactive, following rather than leading. Someone called out, "Traffic is stabilizing," and another voice answered, "Latency is dropping," the words carrying through the open door like distant signals of recovery. Ethan did not look back, his attention fixed on the layers beneath the surface, the parts of the system that would determine whether this was temporary or real. He adjusted a routing parameter, then another, isolating residual instability, allowing healthy segments to support the rest without overwhelming them. It was not dramatic, not visible in a single moment, but gradual, deliberate, the kind of correction that required patience rather than force. A faint reflection of the console lights moved across his face, steady, controlled, revealing nothing of urgency, only focus. Richard exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding without realizing it, and for a second, the tension in his shoulders eased, not gone, but less rigid. "How did you know?" he asked, the question quiet, almost careful, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar ground. Ethan paused briefly, his fingers hovering above the keys, then continuing without breaking rhythm. "Because it was already there," he said, not turning, his voice calm, grounded. "You just did not see it." The answer settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not defensive, just true. The system responded again, a cluster of nodes returning to stable operation, the console reflecting the change in subtle shifts of color and timing. Outside, the sound of movement slowed, fewer rushed footsteps, more controlled pacing, as if the building itself was adjusting to the new balance. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the screen, verifying each correction, ensuring that nothing was hidden beneath the surface, nothing waiting to break again. He knew this stage, the quiet after the initial collapse, where everything looked better, but only if you did not look too closely. "It is holding," someone called from the operations floor, a note of relief in their voice, but not certainty. Ethan did not respond, not yet, because holding was not the same as stable. He ran one more diagnostic sequence, deeper than the others, tracing the system from its core outward, confirming that the structure he had imposed was being accepted, not resisted. The results appeared slowly, line by line, consistent, aligned, no sudden deviations. He exhaled softly, a small release of tension that only someone paying close attention would notice. Richard watched him, not the screen, not the data, but the way he moved, the way he approached the problem, and for the first time, he saw not a technician, not a background figure, but someone who understood the entire system in a way no title could define. "You should have been in that room," Richard said after a moment. The words quieter than anything he had said before, not a command, not even an offer, just a realization. Ethan did not react immediately, his gaze still on the console, confirming the final alignment of processes. "I was," he replied, his tone even, almost neutral. "You just did not hear me." The lights above remained steady now, no flicker, no hesitation, the hum of the servers. Consistent, controlled, as if the system had found a new center. Outside, the operations floor settled into a cautious calm, people returning to their stations, movement slower, more deliberate, aware now of how quickly control could disappear. Ethan straightened slightly, his hands lowering from the console, not stepping away completely, but no longer actively correcting, allowing the system to sustain itself. The moment stretched, quiet, grounded, filled with the kind of stillness that comes after something has nearly broken but did not. And in that stillness, without any announcement, without any declaration, the truth of the situation became clear to everyone who understood it. Control had not been restored by force or by position, but by the one person who had seen it slipping long before anyone else even knew where to look. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with recognition, the kind that settles slowly into a room when something undeniable has just been revealed. Ethan stepped back from the console, not abruptly, not with any sense of finality, but with the quiet understanding that the system no longer needed his immediate intervention, that it was holding because it had been guided, not forced. The server lights maintained their steady rhythm, green dominating now, amber fading into the background, the hum consistent, grounded, like a structure that had found its balance again. Richard remained where he was, his eyes moving between the console and Ethan, not searching for answers anymore, but processing what had already been shown. "You built all of this into the system," he said after a moment, his voice lower, less certain than before, not questioning the fact, but the implication behind it. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture unchanged, still composed, still calm. "I built safeguards," he replied. "The system followed the design it was given." The distinction lingered, subtle but sharp, separating responsibility from assumption. Outside the corridor, the operations floor had shifted into a controlled recovery, voices steady, movements deliberate, people returning to tasks with a new awareness, a quiet understanding that what had nearly happened could happen again. Through the open door, a technician paused, briefly, glancing into the server room, his eyes landing on Ethan with a flicker of recognition, not of title, but of presence. Before moving on, Richard took a slow breath, his gaze dropping momentarily to the floor, then rising again, recalibrating, not just the situation, but his position within it. "No one told me," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a realization spoken out loud. Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes moving once more across the console, confirming that the stability held, that the system was not hiding any remaining fractures. "You were told," he said finally, his tone even, without accusation. It just did not come from someone you were used to hearing. The words settled deeper than any earlier exchange, not because they were louder, but because they were precise. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the weight of recognition, the kind that does not allow for easy dismissal. He stepped closer to the console, his hand resting lightly against its edge, mirroring a gesture he had made earlier, but now without the illusion of control that had once accompanied it. "Why did you not escalate it further?" he asked, his voice measured, searching for something beyond the immediate failure. Ethan looked at him briefly, then back at the system, the steady lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. "I did," he said. "It just did not move upward." The simplicity of the answer left no space for interpretation, no room for shifting responsibility. The system continued its quiet operation. Around them, stable now, but not forgotten, its earlier instability still present in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. Outside, the building resumed its rhythm, slower, more deliberate, as if each movement carried a trace of what had nearly been lost. Richard straightened, his posture adjusting, not back to what it had been, but into something more measured, more aware. "You were right," he said after a long pause. The words deliberate, each one placed carefully, not offered lightly. Ethan did not react in any visible way, no nod, no acknowledgement, just a steady presence, as if being right had never been the point. The overhead lights remained constant, no flicker, no hesitation, the environment reflecting a stability that had been earned rather than assumed. A faint notification appeared on the console, a final confirmation that all primary systems were synchronized, that the structure Ethan had imposed was holding under load. He reached forward and closed the diagnostic panel, not with a flourish, not as a signal, just as the natural end of a process. Richard watched the motion, understanding now what it represented, not just the resolution of a problem, but the exposure of a gap that had existed long before this moment. "This changes things," Richard said quietly, more to himself than to Ethan, the realization settling into his voice. Ethan stepped back another half step, creating space between himself and the console, between himself and the system he had just stabilized. "It should," he replied, his tone calm, grounded, not demanding change, but stating its necessity. The server room held that moment, quiet, controlled, filled with the steady hum of machines that now operated within a structure they could sustain. And in that controlled silence, the shift was complete, not announced, not declared, but understood by both men standing there. One who had always believed he held control, and one who had just proven what control actually required. The corridor remained quiet after the last diagnostic window closed, not empty, but settled, as if the building itself had adjusted to a new balance it had not known before. Ethan stood still for a moment, his eyes no longer on the console, but on the faint reflection of the server lights along the polished surface, steady green lines moving in quiet rhythm, no longer fighting themselves. Behind him, Richard shifted his weight slightly, the subtle sound of his shoes against the floor echoing. More clearly now that the urgency had passed, and for the first time since the system began to fail, he did not look like a man issuing commands. He looked like someone reconsidering them. "Walk with me," Richard said, his voice calm, not directive, but intentional, as if the space between them required more than just silence. Ethan did not respond immediately, then turned and stepped toward the open door, his movement measured, neither accepting nor resisting, simply continuing. The operations floor greeted them with a different energy now, not the tense fragmentation from before, but a cautious order, people seated again, eyes focused, conversations quieter, more precise. A few glanced up as they passed, their attention lingering a moment longer than before, not out of curiosity, but recognition. Something unspoken shifting in how they saw the man who had just walked out of the server room. Richard moved through the space without his usual pace, slower, aware, as if each step carried more weight than it had earlier that day. They reached the glass-walled conference room that had been filled with certainty not long ago, now empty, chairs slightly out of place, screens dark, the long table reflecting only the overhead lights. Richard stopped near the head of the table, the same position he had occupied before, but he did not sit. He simply rested his hand against the back of the chair, looking at it for a moment before turning to Ethan. "I misjudged you," he said, the words direct, unwrapped, without the structure of corporate language to soften them. Ethan remained standing near the opposite end of the table, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged, not defensive, not expectant. "You did not see me," he replied, his voice even, not correcting, not challenging, just stating what had been true long before this moment. The air in the room felt different now, less sharp, more grounded, as if the earlier tension had been replaced by something quieter, more difficult to ignore. Richard nodded once, slowly, absorbing the distinction, understanding that the problem had not been a single decision, but a pattern. That ends now, he said, more to the room than to Ethan, as if the space itself needed to hear it. He moved around the table and pulled out a chair, not the one at the head, but one along the side, and gestured toward it, not with authority, but with invitation. Sit, he added, his tone steady, no longer layered with expectation. Ethan looked at the chair for a brief second, then back at Richard, not immediately taking the seat, measuring the moment in the same way he had measured the system, not reacting, but understanding. What changes? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a requirement, his voice calm, grounded in reality rather than assumption. Richard exhaled, a quiet release, and for a second, the weight of the day showed in his expression, not as weakness, but as clarity. Structure, he said, visibility, accountability. Each word placed carefully, not as promises, but as decisions. He paused, then added, and who I listen to. Room held that statement, simple, direct, heavier than anything said earlier. Ethan stepped forward then, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with purpose, and pulled the chair out slightly before sitting. His movement quiet, controlled, natural. The distance between them at the table no longer felt like hierarchy, but like alignment, two positions within the same structure rather than above and below it. Outside the glass walls, the office continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the full shift that had taken place inside. Richard placed both hands on the table, not gripping, not asserting, just present, his posture grounded. I want you leading system architecture, he said, the offer clear, direct, without embellishment. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze moving briefly across the table, the empty seats, the reflections in the glass, then back to Richard. Not because of today, Richard added, his voice quieter now, but because you already were. The distinction mattered, and both of them knew it. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, not relaxed, but steady, considering the weight of the offer, not the title itself, but what it represented. Then it has to be real, he said, his tone even, not just when things break. Richard nodded again, without hesitation this time. The certainty different now, grounded in understanding rather than assumption. It will be, he replied. The room settled into a quiet that did not need to be filled, the kind that follows a decision that has already taken shape. And in that stillness, without applause, without announcement, something more significant than a recovered system had been set in motion, a shift not just in roles, but in how control, respect, and understanding would move through the space from that moment forward. The building felt different as the evening light stretched across the glass walls, longer shadows settling into corners that had been filled with urgency just hours before. And for the first time that day, the quiet did not feel fragile, it felt earned. Ethan walked down the main corridor at an unhurried pace, his steps steady against the polished floor, the low hum of the systems behind the walls now consistent, stable, almost invisible again to everyone except him. People moved around him in softer rhythms, conversations low, measured, eyes occasionally lifting as he passed, not lingering out of curiosity, but out of something quieter, recognition without words. The screens throughout the office displayed steady metrics, clean lines, synchronized timestamps, the kind of order that looked simple from the outside but carried the weight of everything that had nearly broken. Ethan paused briefly near one of the large glass panels overlooking the server level below, his reflection faint against the backdrop of blinking lights, now calm, controlled, each signal aligned with the structure he had restored. He did not smile, did not react outwardly, but his stillness carried a different kind of presence, not overlooked, not dismissed, but grounded. Behind him, the conference room door opened softly, and Richard stepped out, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each step now carried awareness rather than assumption. He did not call out, did not interrupt, just walked in the same direction, the distance between them closing naturally without urgency. For a moment, they stood side by side near the glass, both looking down at the system that had nearly failed, neither speaking, the silence between them no longer tense, but understood. "It is steady," Richard said finally, his voice low, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging what he could now see. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, precise. "For now," he replied, his tone even, grounded in reality, not reassurance. The distinction remained, but it no longer divided them. It clarified what mattered. A soft notification chimed somewhere in the distance. Then another, but this time they were routine, expected, part of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the rows of servers below, then shifting to Ethan, not with evaluation, not with authority, but with something closer to respect. "You stayed," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of choice. Ethan's reflection shifted slightly as the light outside dimmed, the city skyline beginning to glow in the distance. "I did my job," he answered, the words simple, unembellished, but carrying the full weight of what that had meant in a moment when he could have walked away. Richard nodded again, more slowly this time, absorbing the difference between obligation and integrity. The hallway remained quiet, the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled, where meaning settled without explanation. A group of employees passed behind them, their voices low, their movements calm, the day continuing, but not unchanged. Ethan stepped away from the glass after a moment, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture unchanged, but his presence now anchored in the space in a way it had not been before. He moved toward the elevator, not looking back, not waiting, just continuing forward with the same steady pace. Richard remained where he was for a second longer, watching the reflection of the system in the glass, then following at a distance that no longer felt like hierarchy, but like alignment. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan stepped inside, turning slightly as he pressed the button for the lower level. The same motion he had made earlier, but in a completely different context. As the doors began to close, the reflection of the hallway narrowed, then disappeared, leaving only the quiet interior and the faint hum of movement. The descent was smooth, controlled, the numbers changing steadily above the door. No flicker, no hesitation. Ethan stood alone, his expression calm, his posture steady, not elevated by what had happened, not defined by it, but aligned with it. Above him, the building continued its rhythm, systems stable, people moving, decisions unfolding, all of it now shaped, in ways most would never fully understand, by the moment when control had shifted from assumption to understanding. When the elevator reached the lower level and the doors opened, a softer light greeted him, quieter, less polished, the space where the system lived without presentation. Ethan stepped out without pause, his footsteps echoing lightly in the corridor, blending into the steady hum that surrounded him. And as he walked forward, without announcement, without recognition, the truth of the day settled into the space behind him, not in words, not in titles, but in the quiet, undeniable reality that strength had never been about being seen. It had always been about seeing clearly when no one else did.